Is it okay to remarry after a divorce? This is one of the questions that we are going to talk about even as we have this conversation revolving around becoming so that we live victoriously and lead others to do the same. Welcome to the Identity Project podcast. My name is Kevin Tindi. The thing about this is it's a question that a number of people have asked me after the previous podcast. People have sent me messages on WhatsApp and they have sent me on TikTok, and I just wanted us to find out how we can be able to know if someone can actually remarry after a divorce or not. What should someone do in case there is a divorce? And so I was going through the statistics, and statistics may vary based on country to country, but one of the things I saw when it comes to the statistics of Kenya, it talks about, this is Daily Nation, it speaks about in January 2023 that the number of homes headed by divorces has risen by 16%. And in 2020, there were 3,476 recorded cases of divorce, and in 2021, 4,987 cases. In 2022, it rose by 5,611. And then it also continues through other research spaces that I found that urban areas have higher rates of divorce. And this means that 1 out of 18 households, you find that there is a family that is led by divorced couples. And it also talks about where you find that separation in Kenya is more common than divorce. And this is among the older couples, the ones that have been married longer. And another one, it says that the higher separation rate is 7.9% for women and 4.6% for men. This is aged between 15 to 49. And since we know that 1 out of 18 households in Kenya, they are headed by someone who has been divorced, it gives the ages, it says between 35 to 39, and these are women who are likely to initiate divorce. Another thing that it mentions, the research that I was going through, it says that some of the reasons for separation include, separation and divorce include alcohol, drug abuse, financial issues where there is no disclosure when it comes to finances, there's cheating, and lastly, there is Westernization. What does the Bible say concerning this? So there are different portions of scriptures that actually talk about this. And the first one that I can go to is the book of Malachi. Malachi chapter 2, I'll do verse 15 and 16. Has not the one God made you? You belong to him in body and spirit. And what does the one God seek? Godly offspring. So be on your guard and do not be unfaithful to the wife of your youth. The man who hates and divorces his wife, says the Lord, the God of Israel, does violence to the one he should protect, says the Lord Almighty. So be on your guard and do not be unfaithful. Other version says God hates divorce. And this is one of the scriptures in the Old Testament. And Malachi, during that time, he was addressing the sins of the priests first, and then he gets to talk about the whole nation where the men had actually divorced their wives and married pagan women. And you see, the children of Israel, one of the things is they were told not to intermarry so that they would get to a place that they would, there's something called syncretism, where they will mix with the pagan gods of the other people, and they will contaminate their religion and their tradition and culture and everything. And so you find that when the children of Israel actually left, they left Egypt, there were some people who were Egyptians that went with them. And the place that they settled, you find that they intermarried them. And in the book of Ezra chapter 9 verse 1 to 4, Nehemiah chapter 13 from verse 23 to 31 talks about all this. And so you find that God in the book of Malachi chapter 2, he is addressing through Malachi that these people had broken the vows of God and the vows to their wives, and they had profaned God's covenant. And after all their sin, they were actually bringing their offerings and crying at the altar, and that's why God was actually addressing this thing. And you find that some things, especially from that culture, to them it was legal, but was it biblical? I will leave it for you to answer. And that's why God was saying that I hate divorce. And this speaks about doing something that God opposes. But divorce from this, it talks about you, that divorce pulls apart that which God pulls together. It is like an act of violence where they ought to be tenderness. And another thing you find that in the Jewish culture during those times, they would tie garments like the way someone will have an engagement ring. And that's why God talks about that. So we are getting to find that in as much as Genesis 2:24 that says that they became one flesh, and that is where the male and the female come together and they get married, and this is where now God has put together and they become one. God is saying through Malachi chapter 2 verse 15 to 16 that God hates divorce, because in as much as children are involved, this is what it talks about, the godly offspring. When you divorce, you are actually going against the plan of God. And also another thing that we are going to look at is the book of Romans chapter 7. Do you not know, brothers and sisters, for I am speaking to those who know the law, that the law has authority over someone only as long as that person lives? For example, by law, a married woman is bound to her husband as long as he is alive. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law that binds her to him. So then, if she has sexual relations with another man while her husband is still alive, she is called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is released from that law and not an adulteress if she marries another man. What Paul is talking here and is building from the teaching of Jesus in Matthew chapter 19. What Paul is talking about here, he's saying that here you are bound by the law, and this speaks about you coming together in holy matrimony. The only way that you can get out of this and you can be able to marry again is actually when the other person dies. Matthew chapter 19, Jesus replied, verse 8, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. What Jesus is speaking here, he's talking about Moses, who permitted because of hardened hearts of the people. And so one of the things that happens is, according to the Jewish law, there are different schools of thought that says that men during those days would divorce because maybe the woman would have bad breath, maybe because of something that was a small issue, and then they would actually divorce. And Jesus says this, I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality. And this is building from the book of Malachi chapter 2. Even though God hates divorce, he's not speaking that divorce is something that you should seek, but he's talking about sexual immorality. You commit adultery, especially if you divorce and then you remarry. Now let us look at what Paul talks about in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 7. From verse 8, he says, Now to the unmarried and the widows I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I do. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. To the unmarried, I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife. To the rest I say this, I, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children will be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbeliever lives, let it be so. The brother or the sister is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live a life of peace. Paul is talking and building from Jesus's story. Jesus's comments in Matthew chapter 19. He's saying that the people that are married, now Paul is talking to a context where people are believers. He's saying that a wife must not separate from her husband. Paul is speaking about separation. But if she does, she must remain unmarried. You are not permitted to marry again, or else you get reconciled to your husband. And then he says, and a husband must not divorce his wife. So if you're married and maybe there's challenges which are always there, you are not permitted to marry again. And then it says to the rest, this now he's talking about if two people were actually not born again and then they got married, and after getting married, they get to a place that one of them gets born again. Let me speak about the woman. If the woman gets married and the husband is not born again and the husband wants to leave, it's okay, the man can leave and you're not bound by such circumstances. You can actually marry again. So that is one of the reasons as to why the Bible is saying you can remarry, you can marry. If it's a man who was married to a woman and they were not born again, but now after the marriage, the man gets born again and the woman is not, and the woman wants to leave. If they want to leave, it's okay. You are not bound by such circumstances. You are okay to marry again. But if she wants to stay, it's okay. Or if he wants to stay, if you got born again after marriage, it's okay. You can still maintain the marriage covenant. But now this is from a Christian perspective. Paul continues to say, for the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise your children will be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. And this speaks about that the influence of the person that got born again can actually lead the other person to get to a place that they can also accept Jesus Christ. And I have different illustrations. I know of a friend who they were clubbing, they were living just the normal and unbelieving life, and there was a lot that was involved. And so one day, this man got to be invited to a church, and he went to church and got born again. And after getting born again, because he loved the wife, now he started to see marriage from a different perspective. And after seeing marriage from a different perspective, he chose not to leave the marriage. And after choosing not to leave the marriage because children were involved, after him choosing not to leave the marriage, they got to a place that also the wife, one day, they went together to church, and the wife accepted Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. And now, as we speak, they are married, and their union was blessed by spiritual authorities. The late Miles Monroe said something, that the word marriage comes from a Latin word that is a military term that speaks about you can only get out of it through death. You can only get out of it through death. And since you can get out of it through death, that means that what God has put together, the only way that you can be separated, and this qualifies what it talks about in the book of Romans chapter 7, when someone passes on, or the Lord calls them home, this is where now you are free to marry someone else. And then another thing that the late Miles Monroe mentioned, he mentioned that divorce is actually worse than death. He was trying to paint a picture as to why God hates divorce. And he was talking about this. He was saying, supposedly, two people are married, and then children are involved, and then one person initiates the divorce, and after initiating the divorce, you get that through the divorce, maybe they were going to the same church, and this is in a Christian context. Maybe you're going to the same church. Maybe you are in the same locality. There's a lot that had been involved when it comes to purchase of property, investments, and all those things. Think about the pain. Think about the things that you had planned your future with the other person. And he was trying to say that if someone dies, and God forbids, you find that someone will go through the mourning and grieving process. And after that, after maybe months or years, someone can choose to marry again. And this is how he was painting the picture as to why divorce is actually worse than death. The other thing that can make someone to get to marry again, I've talked about one, both people were non-believers, and then somewhere you got born again, and the one who is not born again decides to leave, you're free to marry. And then the other one I've talked about, death. The third one, and this comes from the story of Benny Hinn. Benny Hinn got to a place that he divorced the wife divorced him, or they divorced, and after that they got to a place that after walking through the journey of soul searching and looking at the consequences and being talked to and having a time to pray and just to reflect, they remarried. They came back together. So that is the third instance that you can find that if you're divorced, you can actually marry. Since I gave the statistics that in Kenya you find that separation is high, you find that divorce, and we say that Kenya is actually like we said, it's like up to over 75-85% Christian. This means that since 1 out of 18 households is where you find that the families are being led by divorcees, this can mean that Christians are actually involved in that. Let me mention something from a research I saw. It is said that when people become older and maybe they are looking for spouses, they come from the world and they get into the space of the church. And when they come to church, they get married at the altar. And after that, they get to a place after marrying at the altar, and this is something that they had not signed up for. Maybe they did not go for premarital counseling classes, which it is said that it reduces the rate of divorce by a certain percentage. I think the last time I checked, up to 65%. And since they did not go to such classes, and you find that it is also said that the second marriage after divorce is actually, the rate is actually high. So there's a possibility that the second marriage will likely end in a divorce. And so since all these things are happening, and someone finds someone in church, and then they got to an altar and they get married and everything, and they had come from the world, and since they see that I did not sign up for this, because in the vows there is the for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part, you find that someone gets to a place that they initiate a divorce. And this is someone who was worldly, but they want to divorce from the church. And this wants to paint a picture that the divorce rates in church is actually high. And this does not mean that divorce within the church is not prevalent. Yes, it is, but there's also another side to look at it from. And another thing that I can talk about, especially when it comes to this, because we are seeing that majority of the households, or 1 out of 18 households, is led by divorcees. We get to find that some of the things, and I mentioned about Westernization, that since people want to divorce, you find that people may come together in marriage, and they may treat marriage as a contract and not as a covenant. And this is where, when things become tough, when maybe people get bored of each other, because I remember when I was in one of the premarital counseling classes, we were asked if love holds the marriage together or the marriage holds love together. And I remember we were given an illustration of someone who was carrying a water jar and there was water in it. And he says the water is actually the love and the jar is the marriage. So which holds the other together? And we learned that it was actually the marriage, because you find that sometimes you will feel that you don't love the person that you got married to. You will feel that there are sometimes you will question, why did I even get married to this person? But because you remember that it's a covenant and not a contract, you will get to a place that in sickness and in health, during the good times and the bad times, you will get to be in a place that you will allow the cord, which is the third strand, to be able to hold you together, and this is God. Another thing about marriage is you find that there may be a lot of conflicts, there may be a lot of things that are happening in marriages, but one of the things that, since God says that He hates divorce, He wants us to get to a place that we fight this thing together. We fight this thing together, because there is no place I've seen in the Bible that people can just divorce because you got, I'm tired. There's something that I learned also called compassionate fatigue. Compassionate fatigue is where you have fought many battles as couples, you have gone through counseling, you have done this and that, you have had mentors and everything, and you fought. And after you fought, you got to a place that after everything has settled, this is where now you give up. But the Bible speaks about the ministry of reconciliation. God has given us the ministry of reconciliation. That's why if maybe two parties are separated, they can get to a place that there are spiritual authorities above them. There are mentors and there are counselors and there are people to surround you. One of the things that we have is marriage enrichment groups that we get to meet once in a while, and we discuss about the challenges and the issues that are affecting us, especially the people that have been married for less than 10 years. And this is where we get to be in spaces where people share the things that you find people do not talk about. And this is where we find that we can push once more, we can pray once more. Yes, things may be tough, but you can get to a place that you fight for this marriage. Because when you look at the consequences and the things that happen after divorce, like what Monroe said, you find that it is worth fighting for the marriage. It's worth fighting for the godly offspring. It's worth worth fighting, because it is God who has brought you together, and let no man put us asunder. There's another question that I was asked. What about blended families? Can people come together and still marry? For me, I will say like what Paul said. If you are married before the blended family, and since you are married before the blended family, and maybe one of the parties was not born again, and also you are not born again, and after you got born again, the other person decides to leave, it's okay, you can get into a marriage. There's someone who reached out to me some time back, and he said that I was married when I was during the times of Dunda. It was the times of raving, times of going to the club and all those things. And then he told me my wife, we had one child, and my wife left because he said, I am too churchy. I go to church and all those things. And then he was asking me, is it okay for me to get married again? And I had to walk him through what the Bible talks about. And since I had to walk him through what the Bible talks about, he got to a place that he saw that actually he's been released from what the Bible says in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 15, that the brother or the sister is not bound by such circumstances. And a few months later, he walked down the aisle, and now he's living with his wife. Another thing is, this is a question that I've had, and someone was asking me, can a pastor officiate a wedding of someone who had been divorced and they are marrying again, and the reason as to why they are marrying again is unknown? I think one of the things when it comes to premarital counseling classes, and you can ask these questions, and I'll have someone, in case the questions continue to come, I'll bring someone who is in the premarital counseling classes who will answer all these questions. You find that when it comes to such, I will say that when you join a premarital counseling classes, especially in the church that I go to, they have to ask you questions. Have you two been living together? Have you two been sexually active? Have you two been in a way that maybe you are in another marriage? What is it that maybe you need to disclose about the other person that needs to be disclosed now, so that when you get into the union, it's not something that will affect the marriage? So these are some of the questions that are being asked before you get to the place that a wedding is being officiated by a minister of the gospel, because marriage is an institution that has been ordained by God. And so for me, I will say, may we do marriage the godly way. Lastly, I will say this: marriage is an institution, and you find that it is an evangelistic tool that makes us more like Christ. Marriage is an evangelistic tool that makes us more Christ-like. If you want to become more and more Christ-like, and God has called you into marriage, get married, and this is where you're going to become more and more like Christ. And in case you have any other question, you can just reach out through the comment section, and we are going to grow in this journey together.